controls. We're going to do a deep dive through some of these controls families and understand again what they are asking for. So diving right into it, with all of the CMMC controls and all across NIST overall, you'll see everything starts with the -1 controls. The -1 controls are all asking that you should have a policy and a procedure that you maintain as well. These policies should cover every single header within every single family. So for example, if you see A1, that's always referring to an access control policy. Or if it's AU1, it's asking for an audit logging policy. Few requirements around the policy. Obviously, they be adhered to and disseminated to all the appropriate personnel. They also should be reviewed on an annual basis as well. So the easiest way to kind of go about this policy way is typically look at the 800-171 requirements. If you have existing policies today, do a gap analysis on those and see where the holes are between the policies and what the requirements ask today. So moving on, what is access control? I'll start with this is the main family and it's one of the longer controls that you'll see within CMMC. The access control family, again, it wants to cover the methods, technologies, and processes for the management of how you provision accounts within the system. Or not just provision them, but transfer, terminations, etc. And some of the related control families you'll see would be like identification, authentication, audit and accountability, to talk about if you're getting logs sent from any account management actions, and also obviously configuration management as well to get an understanding of what components are going to be required for access control. So, big question, how do you get compliant? The first thing is you want to have a robust account management process, right? So again, as we talked about earlier, it's not just the provisioning of it, but it's the transferring, any modifications to that account, and how do you handle terminations of those accounts. Now, there's three types of accounts usually that organizations have to worry about. There are user accounts, there's the service or the machine accounts, and then there's shared accounts, right? So something where, if you have just a break class account or something like that multiple people might log into. Being able to protect those accounts the right way and ensuring that you have the appropriate account management around it. A documented method for separating the roles and responsibilities. So a lot of times we've seen organizations use stuff like a RACI chart, which works excellent because you're able to identify who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and finally who's informed. Right? So having that methodology we've seen help organizations quite a bit in just kind of disseminating the roles that are required between to make the system run. There's an auditing capability in place to track some of these account management actions. You don't want people to add, or even your administrators, right, internally, to kind of just add whoever they want, delete accounts as as they want. Again, you want to have some of that accountability there, and that's where these log capabilities will help kind of enforce that. Configuration settings that are applied to the access control policy, right? CMMC just typically leaves it kind of open-ended to say the organization can define this. So a lot of these things you should be defining in the policy. Typically, standardized industry best practices, you'll see there's around account lockouts, concurrent sessions. Account lockouts, usually see it's like within 15 minutes. Concurrent sessions, you'll see it'll be, don't have more than 2 or 3 administrator sessions going on at the same time, and having a time limit around session terminations as well. And if you are susceptible or applicable to some other guidelines that you might be adhering to as well, some of those might be prescriptive. So it's always a good idea to kind of look at that and design your policies accordingly. Remote access control, that's another big one. So this one's talking about VPNs, any bastions or jump hosts that you might use. How are people gaining remote access into the environment, right? What are the protections in place? Do they have to MFA? Do they have to have, the private public key pairing? So discuss that, and also about what that connection looks like as well. Are they going over an encrypted, are they going over SSH, right? So these are the type of things that you always want to talk about also in your access control. Who has access to those remote access capabilities, etc. Some of the tools in access control, again, this is kind of just to help. This is not an endorsement at all of any of the tools. This is just what we've seen kind of common across a lot of organizations that we've seen that are used. So ticketing systems like ServiceNow or Jira, account management tools, you'll see like Active Directory, obviously Okta. If you're, any AWS, you're using IAM, so etc. For remote access, sorry, there's a typo here, but there's like Bastion host, SSH access, etc. So these are the type of tools you want to take advantage of here. Moving on to the next one, awareness and training control. Now, this one, again, it's a pretty short family, right? And the main thing here is that it wants to ensure that you have an appropriate security awareness training program in place. So that means there's a general security awareness training that can be provided to everybody, right? And these are basic things like, how to recognize insider threat. Don't click on any links that you just get from a random source, etc., from not a trusted source. So those types of things, you should have a program in place to kind of train your people, technical and non-technical from an organizational standpoint, just to have that general security awareness and training. And typically, again, it also has timelines of when they should be provided this training. So it's usually with onboarding, right? As soon as somebody joins, having them take this training to understand their roles and responsibilities and their general security responsibility and duty as to the organization, and also an annual refresher as well to remind them of what those requirements and that approach looks like. And specifically with CMMC, you should always have a slide in there on how to handle CUI. Right, and we'll dive into this more as we kind of continue on to the other controls. But you also, with CUI, there's specific markings and there's specific handling requirements around that. So it's always important to, especially as an organization, if you're supporting the DoD and DIB as a whole, or if you have multiple customers, right? It's always a good idea to kind of understand what type of CUI you're processing and making sure your folks are trained well enough to know how to handle that CUI. The other thing is role-based training. Now, this isn't for everybody, but it is going to be people that have specific roles and responsibilities, that require that additional training. Specifically, obviously, ones that are going to be handling CUI. So the ones we have here are primarily like tech stack ones who are helping managing the information system. But some of the other ones, again, you also want to consider any other roles like HR or anybody that's handling specific CUI records that also might need role-based security training. Again, typically when auditors will come in and they'll look at, say, hey, do you have role-based training? They're usually looking for people that manage the information system as a whole. So it's usually developers, DevOps, support teams, etc. And last but not least, it's always maintaining a record of all these training records, right? You need to be able to prove to your auditors, or not just even to your auditors, to be able to, for yourself to understand and have accountability of who actually took the training and if there's people that need refreshers, etc. So again, these are mandatory requirements that you maintain these training records, and they're provided on a regular basis here. So these are all things that kind of work with you to help with this compliance. And again, just for anybody kind of following along, I'm not diving into each control, but we are diving into the overall family. So that way, and a lot of, specifically for AT, you'll see it maps pretty easy. There's only 4 controls, right? So it's pretty easily done there. Some of the tools to be aware of for security awareness and training, right? Obviously, if you have a learning management system and you can take advantage of one, that's fantastic. If you don't have the investment to make it an LMS system, manual processes work just fine, right? But there needs to, if you're gonna use a manual process, you also have to make sure that you're maintaining actual records of this, right? So you want to be able to prove that, yes, we have a way to track all of this training that's being taken by everybody. So the next one here is audit and accountability. Audit and accountability, again, this is to ensure that you have the appropriate logging and monitoring in place, right? So some of the related controls that we've already talked about, access control, but audit logging will also have a big part in your incident response, right? If there's ever an incident that occurs, that's the first place everybody's going to look, right? Is to say, hey, what did the logs say? And again, SI controls as well, because it talks about the larger information system monitoring. So how do I get compliant? The first thing, again, you'll see is that you have to know what events you have to capture, right? So these are like somebody logs on, logs off. If somebody does an account management action, adds a new account, deletes an account, makes some changes to the baseline configuration. So these are the type of things you need to identify what events need to be captured. Now, the other thing that you also need is you need a way to be able to digest this audit logging information and take action on it accordingly, right? So typically we've seen the easiest ways to centralize this somehow. And again, there are manual processes to do this. Typically, we've always seen it like if you have a SIM tool, it makes life a whole lot easier. But again, depending on your organization size, you can also have manual processes in place that'll help you put compensating measures. So first thing is, again, try to have it centralized. Having it centralized is important so you can get a overarching view of what's happening within your environment. You have to ensure that they're being reviewed. And typically what we've seen is like try to do it on a weekly basis, right? And if there's something to report on, that there's a cadence around that as well. So you're generating audit reports from all of those components. And reporting, and have a process to report on them in the correct fashion. And again, you'll see this, and if you already have it, it'll tie into your incident response pieces as well. The other thing is having on-demand audit report generation, right? So again, having a SIM tool helps a lot, right? Because you're able to get a centralized view and be able to produce those reports fairly quickly. Protection of audit tools and reports. Again, you want to make sure that not everybody in your organization has access to auditing capabilities. It's restricted to a select number of people that have that need to have, if it be the security team or an admin team, etc. And the other thing is you also want to make sure that you're getting read-only reports, right? You don't want to have somebody, or even with administrative privileges, to be able to modify any of these security reports, or logging reports. As we talked about, having a reporting process in place. Again, if you have an IR team or if you have a SOC team, these are always great. But if you have dedicated, security representatives to kind of help with that process, it always makes life easier. Understanding smaller organizations, some people might wear multiple hats, right? But you have to ensure that there is a way for you to track, get alerted, and report on these audit logs that you're getting, so that you can take the appropriate action. And there's a designated representative to take these actions. Yeah. Reporting in place as well. Again, that you want to have a cadence that you're reporting, say at least on a monthly basis or a weekly basis, to to identify any anomalies within the environment. Again, some of the tools that you can use, there's SIM tools, obviously, there's Splunk, there's other ones out there as well. The one thing I would make sure, again, if you are going to use any external service providers, is to make sure that they can handle the same CMMC level compliance as you all, right? And I think in the past, the direction from CMMC is, hey, look for companies that have FedRAMP moderate. It just makes life that much easier. But again, those are some of the things that you need to be aware of when you're selecting some of these external services, so people are aware of what's being provided to them. Okay, and if they meet CMMC requirements. So native logging tools, again, if you're on the cloud, a lot of these things you can use. You have CloudWatch, CloudTrail logs. There's also Azure logs as well. And then in terms of log storage, whether you're on cloud or on-prem, typically you want to have a spot where you're storing your log records, right? And then there's backups of those log records as well. Using a cloud service provider is usually, we've seen, the most efficient way to do this, again, because you can set the retention policies, you can set those accordingly, and it's done pretty automatically if you set it up right. All right, moving on. Configuration management. This control is going to cover talking about the baseline configurations and how do you manage that. and overall change management, right? How changes are enforced within the environment, what's the process to evaluate them, etc. And then the system inventory as well, right? Excuse me. The controls you'll see are like access control and SI to be able to, ensure that the right people are being able to make these configuration changes, and for SI to make sure that you have a way to monitor these people who are making any changes to the environment as well. How do you get compliant? Again, one of the main things that the controls are asking for is that you have a documented baseline configuration of your system. Whether you have a tool to do this or you're documenting this manually, it's up to you, but ensure that you do have that process or this baseline configuration identified to say, yes, these are the things that we need to make the system run, right? Ensure there's there's a proper inventory management process in place, right? Again, if you're using tools, great, it makes your life a whole lot easier. But if you are using manual processes to help with this as well, completely acceptable. But you have to make sure that you're meeting the requirements around how to manage that. So that means, documenting them, the component name, IP addresses, and if for a template, again, these templates are a little bit more in detail than CMMC, but if you can always find like the FedRAMP inventory templates and kind of pull from those and use the fields that are applicable to you. The other thing is the system hardening process, right? It's looking that, hey, are you doing CIS level 1 benchmark scanning? Are your components hardened to the most restrictive mode possible, right? And the reason I say possible is because if you follow the CIS level 1 benchmarks completely, the system probably doesn't work, right? So it's not that you can't have exceptions, it's that you identify what those exceptions are and you understand what those risks are, and obviously how do you compensate for those risks of not meeting some of these benchmarks. So again, it's not that nobody expects to be 100% compliant, but you do need to have a pretty positive threshold of compliance and have a process around how you're handling deviations and exceptions. Again, the other ones you can also use are some of the STIGs that are out there as well. So we can go, you can look those up as well if your agency or organization has specific ones that they required you to adhere to. And lastly but not least, the change management process, right? You need to have one. First of all, you have to document all the tickets, right? Or all the change tickets that are going to be happening, and identifying what changes, can be routine, right? And what changes actually are going to be major impacts, right? So in order to do that, you have to have a process to evaluate not just the functional impact of a change, but also the security impact of a change to understand how to address it within your control set as well. And lastly but not least, having the appropriate approvals in place to ensure that all of the changes have been looked at by the appropriate set of eyes and given their blessings to continue forward. All right, some of the tools in configuration management, again, depending on if you're using cloud service providers or there are different tools. There's no way an endorsement of any of these tools. There are multiple ones out there, but again, if you are using external tools that are, your data is going outside of the boundary, just make sure they do meet the same CMMC level compliance that you are subject to as well. And for most people, it'll be level 2 at the minimum. All right. For system hardening, again, you can a lot of times for these CIS benchmark scans, if you're already doing some level of vulnerability scanning, a lot of these tools already have a built-in CIS benchmark scanner, right? So you can set it on that cadence to do as part of your vulnerability scanning to also do that compliance check as well. And then again, for the change management tools, again, to have it documented, having that process in place. Some of the more popular tools that we've seen are Jira and ServiceNow, just to be able to track that entire process. And one thing I kind of left off here is system inventory. Again, so you can use it as a manual process, but again, if you're using something like a ServiceNow, it typically is a lot helpful, right? Or other inventory tools out there as well. All right, jumping into identification and authentication. Now, this control again, it's just talking about, it relates to access control that we talked about in the first slide or in the first set of controls, but it's talking about the granular level of the user identifiers and the authenticators that are used to access these accounts, right? So where access control is talking about the accounts as a whole, this family is speaking to more of the identifiers and the authenticators that are going to be used to access those accounts. So how do you get compliant? Again, having a user ID process in place, right? So this is how we provision user IDs. So we might say first.lastname@acewcloud.com, right? Or, and then also setting the parameters around those user IDs as well, right? So to say, okay, if I have another Anwar Kibriya join, right, and I'm how am I going to distinguish between the two, right? And also, again, preventing the reuse of these user identifiers as well. Typically, we've seen most organizations stick to about 2 years. They prevent the reuse of a user identifier before recycling them. But again, depending on your any other requirements you might have, your agencies might ask for stringent or more lax type of requirements. Inactivity requirements. So if a user ID is not being used, right, for how long is the user ID been inactive before you can officially kind of disable that user ID? And again, as you'll see, it has a lot of overlap with the access control family here. For the authenticators, right? Not just talking about passwords, it's also talking about any keys that you might have, right? Crypto keys that are, if any public-private key pairing, right? Where are you storing these keys, right? Who has access to them? What are the process to be able to get provisioned one of these keys? What's the initial password provisioning look like, right? Does somebody get a temporary password, then they go in and set their own password? So these are the type of things that it's really looking for to help with that. Multi-factor authentication. Again, this one, you got to have an MFA capability in place, so it's not just a user ID and password. Typically, it's either nowadays, again, you can use Duo and Okta that'll have like MFA that you can get pushes straight through your phone. So it's important to have that set up as well to access the environment. Password complexity requirements, right? Uppercase, lowercase, special characters, length of characters, all those types of things are what this family is really talking about. And you have to make sure that you have, these are all covered within your IA policy as well to kind of enforce this as well. No encryption of authenticators in transmission and storage, right? Anytime you're sending passwords, make sure they're encrypted with FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography, right? So don't store passwords in clear text, right? So those types of things. If you have any shared accounts where you're storing, multiple people are going to be using account or using those authenticators. Do you have them in a vault, right? Do you have an appropriate audit logging capability in place? If somebody leaves that shared group, right? How do you do rotation of that authenticator? And overall, like while we're speaking on rotation, having a password rotation policy or key rotation policy, etc. Some of the tools again that come up in this family, obviously for password management, it'll be like Active Directory. You can do it through Okta, and again, some of the MFA tools being Okta and Duo as well. And again, if you are storing authenticators somewhere, right, there's Azure Key Vault, and there are different tools out there for that as well. All right, incident response. So again, as we talked about earlier in the AU families, this will have a lot of overlap with that. And sorry, not overlap, but more of a dependency on each other, right? So the incident response family, it's talking about how do you respond and handle incidents, right? First part is obviously have a robust documented IR process, right? Have an incident response plan, identify all of the major key players, right? Who those people are, who those resources are. And also, if you look at some of the NIST guidance for incident response, it talks about different areas like the preparation, detection, response. Have a response to all of those areas and make sure that you're looking at in your incident response plan and address those areas to say, okay, this is how we prepare for incidents. These are how incidents are detected. And if you're following, again, the dependencies of the controls, detection a lot of times is going to come from those logging and those monitoring capabilities. Identifying, again, we already talked about here, and identifying the key IR personnel and resources, right? What are their process to get alerted as well, right? Do they have a call tree in place? Are they getting alerts directly from a SIM tool or other audit logging component? Are you documenting these IR incident responses in a ticket, right? What's the analysis that you're doing to ensure that something is even an incident, right? There's security events and then there's incidents, right? So that process in your, and you should definitely document this in your IR plan as well, is how are you going from point A to point B of saying something's just a security incident to, or a security event, to now this is a security incident, right? So what's that level of analysis that also goes into that? Also reporting on, customer notification, right? If something is going to affect the customer directly, how are you notifying them, right? Do you have a page set up? When are the cases, are you going to notify the customer, right? Are you going to notify them for any event? Probably not, but you are going to notify them in the event it is an area where their data might be compromised, right? So having that process in place is very important in this control as well. And lastly, last thing on this control family is the testing of that IR plan, right? You can't know how good of a process you have until you actually test it, right? So doing functional tabletop exercises to, having a scenario of, okay, if this event happened or if an incident happened, how would we respond to that incident? Okay, and then documenting those in an after action report. Also, it's a good idea to also do them on an annual basis to make sure that you're keeping up with the latest technologies that you guys have or processes that you all have, and how it does have an impact to the IR process overall. And lastly, also documenting some of the lessons that you might learn from the IR process, or testing of that IR process. Some of the ticketing systems, again, for IR, right? How to document the IR ticket and whatnot. Again, there are manual processes in place that you can have, right? By all means, if you have like, a WebEx group or a chat group or something like that, where these are secure lines of communication where you're kind of communicating with each other. There are different ways to do this, right? So it doesn't always need to be a ticketing system, but it does need to be documented when an incident response happens. So you can have a manual process, totally fine, but you do have to make sure they are documented, right? And additionally, any SIM tools that always come and help with incident response, right? For all the logging components and whatnot, it's always good. SIM tool helps because not only is it centralizing, but it's also going to do some alerting for you as well. All right. So system maintenance, again, this control, we're talking about the how are we doing maintenance of the system, right? So it's kind of like what it sounds, but you're also looking, some of the interconnected families, you'll see like stuff about physical and environmental, right? If you have vendors coming on site, how do you handle them? Any external vendors, how do you grant access to people doing system maintenance? How are some of these maintenance activities logged, right? So these are the type of things that, control families that kind of intertwine with this family as well. So how to get compliance? Again, the first part is have a documented list of all the system maintenance tools and personnel, right? So these are the maintenance tools we use. These are the personnel that we have, right? And again, identify what, we talked about this a lot, and I know I'm kind of regurgitating this point over and over, but ensure across your supply chain or the system maintenance personnel you're using or the tools you're using that they are also compliant to the same level of CMMC that you are. So that way you can ensure that these are the appropriate people that can kind of handle any data or that can be classified potentially as CUI. So any external vendor service providers, identify them and identify specifically the vendors who have or have to handle CUI, right? Can handle CUI. Ensure records of maintenance are kept. Again, having a maintenance log if you have like physical on-site maintenance, having tickets in place to put in, say, hey, these were the maintenance that was completed, and again having an audit record of it as well to understand what type of activity was performed. Have a process around both routine and emergency maintenance, right? Some maintenance, again, you're going to do on a regular basis, going to happen all the time, so they might not need the same level of scrutiny as something that, an emergency maintenance thing, right? You might have a hot fix that has to happen right away or whatever. So uh, there's ensure that you have a process around both and you're taking into account both things as well, right? So if you need different tags and tickets, identify any additional like tests that you might need, maybe for an emergency maintenance, because some of them might happen after the fact. So just ensure that that process is solidified, understood, and that it's that you have appropriate testing kind of incorporated across both of these scenarios. Identify any data types within the system components, right? Again, specifically with CMMC, need to make sure identify what if you have any CUI data on any of these components that are going out for maintenance, right? So if there are CUI data going out for maintenance, again, make sure that they're appropriate CUI vendor, or make sure that you don't send those data sets there, or they're appropriately scrubbed before being sent out for maintenance. Processes around non-local maintenance. Again, we live in a very virtual world, so understanding there is a lot of non-local maintenance that's happening. So again, making sure that this ties into the remote access process as well, to make sure that this process around if people are coming in VPNing or SSHing into an environment, etc., that there are proper processes around that as well. Some of the tools in maintenance, again, for the main things I'll cover here, if you're talking about maintenance records, so say emails, Jira, Snow tickets, these are all fine, right? Maintenance logs of some sort, any of those things will suffice, but ensure that there are records of all of this. Non-local maintenance, again, having bastion host, VPN, and MFA for people to kind of have that secure way of performing that non-local maintenance, and again, the audit logging pieces around what type of activity they're performing as well. All right, media protection. This is one of those controls, again, like if you're residing on a SaaS, a lot of times for other certifications you might not have had to address. But with CUI, because it's looking at both physical and digital media and structured and unstructured data sets, this is something that does come into scope, right? So media protection, it's not just in CMMC world, it's not just, system maintenance data, but it's like if you have any paper data, right? Any PowerPoint presentations, any printouts that you have, you need to be appropriately classified, marked, and you have to be in agreement with your agency as well to say, okay, what's classified as CUI. Now, this one, again, you can expand on this quite a bit, because it's not it's about, not who just has access to this data, right? But it's also having a classification around that data, right? So if something is marked CUI, how are you handling that CUI information? How's that data set handled, right? Where are you allowed, if you have CUI data that's marked, right? You might not be able to print it at all of the printers, right? There might be a CUI specific printer. So these are the type of things that, with media protection, it does come into place. Also, another thing you'll see is stuff like data loss prevention, right? So how do you ensure that data is not going to the wrong hands, right? Or again, with CUI data, you need to make sure that there are appropriate custodians handling those data as well. So with that, again, you need to make sure that the data is labeled accordingly, the right people are having access. And a lot of times we've seen tools like DLP tools that are coming out. And again, not an endorsement to any of these tools, but there's a couple of them out there, like Microsoft has one called MIP or AIP, whatever their title is of the day, that does a lot of DLP protection as well. I know there's tools like Varonis. So there are tools that are, and Titus, I think. So there are tools that are slowly coming out to kind of help with this, but there does need to be a process around kind of managing both structured and unstructured data for media protection here, specifically as it relates to CMMC. Having restrictions on removable devices, right? for specifically for CUI, right? You don't want people just kind of plug in USBs. Like if they're handling that data like that, right? You need to make sure that certain USB devices are CUI compliant. Uh, USB devices, so that way, or they meet at least the security requirements that CMMC requires of it, whether it be encrypted or whatnot, to ensure that all that data is protected accordingly. Okay. In terms of the media sanitization as well, again, we talked about it just in maintenance as well. Any hard drives, any disk wipes that you have to do, and again, for paper, in this case as well, that you're disposing and sanitizing them in the right way, whether it be shredding them through a document through a paper shredder, right, or doing a whole wipe of your entire system, right, or the components on the system. So either way, again, you need to account for both when you're addressing this control family. Oh, sorry. Tools and media protection, again, the ones that we just talked about, MIP, there's Titus, there's Varonis, etc. Again, the other thing is having CUI specific printers. This is another important one if you have a lot of people printing documents. If you are going to have people that are printing, say, non-CUI information or are not allowed to see CUI data, you want to be very careful of how you're setting your printers up as well to ensure that people who are not supposed to have that access and see those documents don't see those documents. So a lot of times we've seen there's certain, for organizations, that they'll designate certain printers to be like, only printed this one for CUI information. And of course, there'll be, labeling around that printer as well to say, this is only allowed for CUI data and whatnot. Okay. Personnel security, right? So personnel security is talking about the the process that you kind of have to vet your people, right? And a lot of times this is talking about when people initially get onboarded, right? Do you do background screening of personnel, right? What do you look for about what type of items do you look for, right? If it's clearance that's required, credit, criminal, employment history, etc., right? What's the process in kind of bringing on board, and what are the checks to validate that they are who they say they are? And sure, there is a robust process for terminations and transfers as well. Again, if there's people who are transferring from one department to another, and that department, maybe they didn't handle CUI data, right? Having that process in place to understand that, hey, now you're coming into a department where they're handling CUI data, you have to take these XYZ trainings and understand how to handle that data accordingly. Vice versa, right? If somebody's transferring or being terminated out of a group, right? Do they have any CUI data on their possession, right? Whether it be paper or on their computer, etc. What's that process through your termination or transfer process, right? Is there a debrief that you guys have to go through as well? A lot of times we've seen people have like a debrief checklist where they'll cover all of these items that HR will run them through to make life easier for that and to streamline it. Okay. Tools and personnel security, again, there's the obvious ones like ServiceNow and Jira for the ticketing. There's multiple background investigation vendors that you can use, so it's up to your discretion who those are. I know there's HireRight, KnowBe4, so there are multiple ones out there that you can leverage that do perform background investigations. All right. Now, the physical and environmental control, right? The PE family. Now, this is talking about again, with CMMC, it's a little different because it's not just talking about your information system. So maybe in past certifications, you might have seen like it's only applicable to the data center. But because CMMC is an organizational cert, it's also talking about any area that CUI is processed, and that includes your office areas as well. Now, how do we get compliant with this, right? Ensure there's physical security protections and safeguards in place, right? So these are the badges, access alarms, cameras, etc., right? Any place where they have CUI, make sure that it's not in a public area, right? Visitors just can't see CUI data everywhere. You have to badge in or whatnot. There's locks, etc. So again, for a lot of from a system-wide standpoint, if you're in a cloud, a lot of these you're inheriting, or if you're in an MSP, a lot of these are inherited. But if you are kind of managing your own on-prem environment, there is going to be a few more things that you kind of have to look into for your information system as well. So there's going to be requirements around how you secure your office and maybe some of the digital or the paper CUI that you process, as well as from a how do you protect the information system that's on-prem as well. All right. And so this also includes alternate storage and processing sites, right? So if you have a backup site in place where CUI is processed there, those also need to be taken into account as well. And then also managing kind of who's coming into the office and or your environment overall in your information system, from if it's in a physical presence, having those appropriate logs in place to record that as well. All right. Tools, again, not endorsing any particular ones. It's just main things that you need to have an alarm system, have cameras in place, ideally have badge readers and locks in place. And if you are in a lease space and things, if you have a guard or anything like that, that always helps. Again, just having the appropriate measures to ensure that not anybody can just access your environment or any area where CUI is processed, and you have appropriate accountability for them. All right, we're almost getting to the end, so I appreciate everybody's patience with me so far. This is a long one. So what is risk assessment? Again, this control is looking that you've identified, understanding how you've gotten to the point of understanding that you're for CMMC level 2, right? Did you do the appropriate evaluation of what type of data you're processing? And as well as talking about any vulnerability scanning or risk assessments that are performed on the system as well. So this one, again, have a set schedule and frequency if you want to get compliance with this control or this family, whether it be internal risk assessments or an external security risk assessments, which you can quote in these controls as well to say that you're engaging with the C3PAO that'll perform this assessment for you, and they'll do it on an annual basis. Additionally, it asks for vulnerability scanning, right, with RA5. It's asking, and one of the things with vulnerability scanning that's important to note, you have to do it at each component level, right? It has to be at the application level, the OS level, the database level, and if you're using containers, to do it at the container level as well. One thing important to note about all this is that it's what's in production. So if you have a lot of components that's in dev or stage test, if it's not production, those are not in scope. So any components in production have to be accounted for and scanned accordingly. And again, a lot of tools that you'll see like Tenable or Qualys, like all of them, they do all of these scans, right? Application OS and a database layer, and there's agents if you have containers as well that they can set to as well. So it's always a good analysis and evaluation for you to do to see what tool best works and meets your need, whether it be one tool or it be multiple tools that you're using. But regardless of what tools you're using, in terms of the remediation around them, they all have to line up. Those remediation timelines have to line up the right way. And the three main ones that I just called out are high, moderate, and low. Obviously, you're going to have critical ones and zero-day patch vulnerabilities as well. So those need to be taken into account. Although CMMC kind of is not prescriptive around what are the timelines around it, the standard best practice you'll see is high 30 days, moderate 90 days, and low being 180 days for remediation. And critical is usually 7 days or 0 to 7 days. The main tools in risk assessment, obviously, you have to pay attention to are just the vulnerability scanners, making sure that you're doing some level of vulnerability scanning at all the component levels that we discussed in the previous slide. All right. CA family, what is security assessment? This one's pretty simple. Again, this one is just asking about the authorization process overall as a whole, right? And then the Kanban process and how do you deal with any external service providers, right? So the main things that it's asking here is, okay, that you maintain a plan of action and milestone, right? That's called a POAM document. So all of the system deficiencies within your environment should be placed in that document. So any vulnerability scanners, any security assessments that come out, or any issues that come out of the security assessments, and any Kanban activities, right? And we'll dive into Kanban here in a second. That you also maintain it and develop a system security plan, right? Obviously, CMMC has one, a template that you can use that it identifies a snapshot in time of your security posture. So this one is addressing all of the security controls, but also having, you know, diagrams and everything in place, like a network diagram, the data flow diagram, and the most important diagram of all, which is the accreditation boundary diagram, right? Drawing a big box around what is in scope for this assessment where CUI data will be processed. For the diagrams, a lot of times if you have one diagram that's really detailed for network boundary and data flow, you can typically use the same one. Obviously there's different ones are recommended if they can articulate things better, but I've seen in the past where people use one diagram, and then for the accreditation boundary diagram they'll draw a line around it, the network diagram stays there, and then the data flow they'll have arrows and or a color legend of some sort that shows which way the data is flowing. So now the Kanban plan, Kanban stands for continuous monitoring of operations, right? So how do you ensure that after you've gone through your assessment, after you've received your authorization, what are the commitments that you're making to maintain that security posture? Typically that's put into a plan of some sort, and then it's that's as a commitment to your customers to say, this is how we plan to ensure our security posture stays this way. So that'll be stuff like doing monthly vulnerability scans or doing annual assessments, so those types of things that you'll be committing to in that plan. Some of the tools in security assessment, again, if you're using GRC tools, that's great. But Excel spreadsheets also work just fine. Depending on your organization size, you might see some value in GRC tools, but again, there's no mandate that you have to use any of these tools. All right, system and communication protection, SC family, right? So this family, again, like some of these families, you'll see they hop around all over the place. So this one is talking about boundary protection, but also encryption capabilities as well around that bound. Oops. So some of the, I think we skipped over the system communication. So system and communication, I'll quickly just kind of go over it here. For this one, you want to ensure that you have the appropriate firewalls in place, right, for external and internal boundaries, to make sure that those are in place for network-based firewalls as well as host-based firewalls, to ensure that those are all captured. And ensure that, again, it'll tie into some of your audit logging and system monitoring capabilities, because those those firewall logs or security group rules should always, generate an alert to say if somebody unauthorized is trying to gain access there. Additionally, the other thing is for encryption. It's pretty standard. The best way to do it, anytime you're dealing with the government, they're always looking for FIPS 140-2. So that's always for data in transit as well as for data at rest as well. Okay. So moving on to SI, system and information integrity. Again, as we talked about for the SC families and the AU families, these controls, these families are going to feed into the overall system monitoring. So this control talks about antivirus, but it also talks about the system and error handling and how the overall monitoring you're going to do for the system as well. So the first thing that it talks about is having a formalized patch. It says flaw remediation when you look at the control, but it's having a formalized patch management process, right? if when you identify these flaws when you're running Nessus or Qualys or whatever vulnerability scanning tool you have that's running it to say, hey, these are the patches that are outdated and whatnot. These are the security firmware updates that you need to do. How are those, what's that process look like, right? So there's a process of identifying it, those which can come through the scanner, and then there's a process of doing the analysis on it, and then as well as doing the remediation as well. So typically we've seen that if you align one process overall, just the remediation process that you have. So again, you'll see this similar to the RA family being a high 30, moderate 90, and low 180, and criticals being at 7 days. That it helps, that way at least you're not dealing with different timelines and it's not confusing for auditors as well, that it all aligns together. The other thing is that this control asks for is that there's antivirus running on some of the in-scope components on a regular basis. Typically, we suggest that you do it on at least a weekly basis, to ensure weekly to a monthly basis, to ensure that you're able to kind of understand the most recent risks that are that are applicable to the system. They should be running on all of the components, right, that can potentially give you entry into the system. So these are servers, endpoints, if you're using containers, running on those as well. That they're also receiving the most up-to-date versions, right? So have it set up on auto update, that it's using the latest signatures and whatnot to perform the scans. Additionally, at any place where you can potentially inject a virus into the thing, if you're doing file downloads or whatnot, that's being scanned with your AV tool as well, prior to being installed. And as we talked about for the system monitoring of these tools for intrusion detection and prevention, and then the overall centralized logging of the system as well, right? So the IDS tool should be reporting into, if you have a SIM tool or something like that in place, should be reporting that to identify any intrusion detection that might be happening, as well as some of the boundary protection tools that might be overlapping with that. So if you have security groups that are sending alerts or whatnot, some way to kind of monitor any internal and external attacks that might potentially be happening on the system. And lastly but not least, this is a very simple one, is to make sure that you're subscribing to the latest security alerts and advisories, right? There's the US CERT, right, that you subscribe to. And I put the URL link on the next slide, and as well as any vendors that you have as well, that put out any security alerts or bulletins to those, that you're keeping abreast of the latest ones. Okay, some of the tools and system and information integrity. Again, the tools for AV, depending on the component level, you'll see different tools available, right? So anywhere from Microsoft Defender to Trend Micro and whatnot. IDS, IPS tools, there's stuff like CrowdStrike, Falcon, GuardDuty. Vulnerability scanning tools, you'll see like Tenable, Nessus, and Qualys, because as it relates to your patch management. And finally, the security alerts and advisories that you see here for the US CERT website that you can subscribe to. All right. And that brings us to the end, and I think I made it under an hour, so kudos to myself. So I appreciate everybody kind of hanging on with me here. Again, I know this was a long session here, so I appreciate everybody's patience, and hopefully this was helpful to everybody. And again, to understand the controls in depth or a little bit more, to do some of the development of the documentation or any advisory help you need overall to get through your CMMC process, please email us at info@asacloud. My name is Anwar Kibriya. Please look me up on LinkedIn, and look forward to connecting with everybody. Thank you all.